Just back at Tim's place, helping with this W140 S500L. It's a 1996 model, so that M119 is mated to a 722.6 transmission, which is kind of rare in Australia. There weren't many of these cars here anyway, but let alone versions with 722.6s is pretty rare. The vast majority have the 722.3, which is kind of dated as a transmission. This one had pretty much failed and was the reason he got this car for basically nothing. Had the spun bushing in the front pump, and it was just pouring ATF out all over the road when he was driving it. It could only be driven for a couple of kilometres at a time before refilling it. Now, long story short, he has actually repaired it, and this is the second time he's removed this from the car, because he did actually get to drive this for 3 kilometres before it started making the infamous whining noise, and then a bit of a crack noise, and then it lost all drive completely. So presumably the front pump has grenaded. I think he made a bit of a rookie mistake, because when he married that transmission to the engine, the torque converter wasn't easily sliding into the end of the crankshaft. He pretty much forced it in there using the bolts of the transmission, which is an absolute no-no. So it may not have been running true, and that's probably what's destroyed the pump. And he might have destroyed the torque converter in the process. Would not surprise me if it's slightly bent now. They're kind of flimsy. So we're just going to pull this apart now and have a look at the carnage. Now, if you were paying attention, the first time I showed this car with the engine running, we were concerned that there was a bit of a knock happening in this engine. And I can confirm categorically that that was not the engine. It was absolutely the failing transmission. So once that was kind of repaired and he drove it around for the second time, the engine was basically silent. Still haven't got the oil feed tube for one of those lifters, but it is on order from Germany, so that will get fixed. So there's only that tick from the lifter. But yeah, the deep knocking sound that we thought was like a big end bearing or something like that when we first got this car is nothing to do with the engine. It was the pump in that transmission. So he's just getting ready to remove this transmission now, and then we can see what's going on. One benefit to the gargantuan 140 is that Tim has come to the realisation that it is really easy to remove and reinstall the engine in this. Even this massive M119, it just slides in and out ridiculously easily. Like from this state here, he reckons he can have the engine in about half an hour. Obviously, that's not including reconnecting the drive shaft and all of the other nonsense, but it's a lot easier than the more compact engine bays. And I guess having that removable radiator support helps a lot as well. This engine bay was designed for the M120 V12, so the little old M119 and even littler M104 would be an absolute breeze to remove and install. Just draining the fluid out of the pan now. That fluid did a grand total of 3 kilometres, and yeah, what a waste. But it's a learning experience nonetheless. So interestingly, the little tabs on the inner gear, one of them is clearly snapped off because that was just sitting in here when this was removed. Hopefully the other one hasn't fallen inside. We're about to find out. We're just taking off the bell housing, and then we can remove the pump and have a good look at it. I suspect what happened is that he's cracked that inner gear when he was reinstalling the transmission, and the first time he took it for a drive, possibly that crack split a bit, and then that inner gear bound up with the outer gear, and then it just seized, and then the torque converter snapped off those little tabs on that inner gear. But we will know for sure quite shortly. So the bell housing is removed. Tim's just going to remove the front pump now, which, as always, is bolted on from behind. We already know that it's ruined. Let's have a look at the extent of the carnage. So what we've established as the most likely cause of failure is the assembly error. When Tim forced the transmission onto the engine by himself, struggling with the weight of it, I guess, and the angle, he heard a crack noise when he was tightening up the transmission against the engine, and what that probably was, most likely, was one of the tabs on the inner pump gear that slots into the end of the torque converter breaking off. He then proceeded to try again to reinstall it, which it went fine the second time, but obviously the damage had already been done by that stage. And then he drove the car around with one tooth on that gear. He does have the modification plate installed for a damaged bell housing. And obviously that gear was not running true. And it's possibly why this is all gouged up now. To the point of actually having a deep gouge into it, where it possibly got that gear to stop and then it sheared off the other tab. That's what I'm thinking happened here, because he does mention that there was a loud crack noise when he was installing the transmission on the engine. I think the damage was already done by the time everything was back in and he went for a drive, and then, yeah, that just finished it off. I suspect the whining noise he heard is probably that gear running against this modification plate, and yeah, everything just got destroyed from that point forward. The bush that the torque converter rides on in the pump is still fine, so it wasn't that. That did not spin. 100% it is the inner pump gear, and you can see where those tabs have sheared off. He's going to go ahead and get the later version 722.9 pump that doesn't have the bushing. It has a roller bearing. It's a much more robust pump. And obviously he's going to need another one of these plates. And for good measure, probably get that torque converter inspected by a professional just to check it for run out, and maybe clean up that end that goes into the pump just to make sure it's all 100% perfect, because you don't want to be doing this a third time. Hopefully he has better luck next time. Here's something interesting for the M119 experts. This is kind of a rare engine, I think, but its compression ratio is in fact 11:1. I bet you don't see that often on the M119s. I wonder what the official power figure of this engine is. Well, I found the answer to my question. This is the supplement to the owner's manual with the Australian specifications for this car, which includes the 11:1 compression ratio engine, and it looks like it's 235 kilowatts, just like the other version. I'm not an expert, but I would assume the upped compression ratio is to regain some of the power lost for emissions reasons. Didn't they cut out the full throttle enrichment on these or something? Other things of interest: this engine doesn't have EGR, and it doesn't have an air pump from the factory. That's just how they were for Australia, so none of that nonsense to worry about. There's the rest of the specs for the other vehicles if you're interested in seeing for Australia.